Welcome to Reading the Gospels Together. And today, in the second half of John chapter 18, we join Jesus as he stands before Pilate. Now, John points out that it's early morning. The rooster has crowed, to Peter's shame. The sun is up, and the religious authorities bring Jesus to Pilate. They themselves cannot enter Pilate's praetorium, which is the word that's used here, as it would render them ceremonially unclean, and they would have to wait 24 hours before they could rejoin the Jewish community, which would be a problem, because Passover is about to begin that very evening. So Pilate has to go out to meet them. And the following exchange reveals a lot. Pilate asked, "What charges do you bring against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Well, then take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. Aha, so it's made clear to Pilate that they expect him to render a sentence of death before even interrogating Jesus. So the seriousness of the scene is set. Pilate is expected to quickly go through the motions with a trial no more credible than that which is already held. Leaving the priests outside, he has Jesus brought into the praetorium to be interviewed. Now, the question I'm often asked is, how do we know what was said? Who reported on the events? In terms of the trial before the high priest, there are several possible answers, including both Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, as well as the so-called unnamed disciple who gained entrance into the courtyard for Peter. But for this interview with Pilate, we have these options. First of all, Pilate himself. Secondly, a Roman soldier or servant witnessing the event. Thirdly, John made it all up, knowing there was an interview of some kind with Pilate, and he filled in the blanks. Or number 4, Jesus in the 40-day period after the resurrection told the story. Now, of these options, option number 1 is unlikely that it's Pilate. There's no evidence that Pilate was ever sympathetic to Christianity after this point, certainly not before, and he would not have discussed this event with the Christian community. Option number 2, a Roman soldier or servant, is quite a bit more likely. There would have been guards present for the interview, as well as servants, including a scribe to record what was said and the subsequent judgment. We know there were soldiers and servants, members of the governing households, who became Christian. The Gospels tell us so. Now, if I were writing a novel, I would have had one of the soldiers present for this interview also be present for the crucifixion. Perhaps even the centurion who proclaims, "Surely this was the Son of God." That's just my fanciful thinking. Option 3, that John just made it up for dramatic effect, is necessary only if you can't accept the possibility of option 2, that there's a soldier or a servant, or the following option, number 4, that Jesus talked about this with the disciples after the resurrection. Now, I think this is the most likely scenario. Surely sometime in those 40 days, one of them would have asked Jesus what happened on that day. As I'm among those who most certainly believe in the resurrection of Jesus and the 40 days he spent among the disciples prior to this ascension, I feel this is the most likely scenario. It's unnecessary to conclude that John made it up out of thin air. Now, however we got it, here's how it went. Pilate begins by asking Jesus if indeed he is the king of the Jews. This shows us that the religious authorities had reported this charge to Pilate, as it would constitute treason against Rome. Pilate is unconcerned as to whether or not Jesus might be the Messiah. That would be a Jewish religious issue. Pilate already said he has no interest whatsoever in that. And Jesus responds accordingly in what is a pretty snappy answer to the question, "Are you king of the Jews?" He says, "Is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about me?" I can only imagine Pilate being surprised to be talked to in this way. But if you look at all the responses Jesus gives at both this trial and that before the high priest, his answers, while seemingly evasive, all follow the same pattern. Every time, Jesus effectively answers, "Well, what do you think?" To Jesus' question, "Did others talk to you about me?" Pilate responds, "Am I a Jew?" Which is to say, do you think I listen to what Jews have to say about anything? Which, given the fact that Pilate is the governor of Judea, gives you a pretty good idea as to just what kind of governor he was. He then says to Jesus, "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you've done?" Pilate's curious as to why Jesus' own people would betray him to Rome in this way. It's highly unusual. The normal pattern would be for the Jews to keep Rome as much out of their internal business as possible. Something's going on here more than what meets the eye, is what Pilate is thinking. Now, for the first time in either trial, Jesus makes a statement rather than respond rhetorically. He says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." We know that Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God, but of course Pilate doesn't know that. Jesus also indicates that his kingdom is not of a military nature. No uprising has prevented his arrest. He is, in any case, not appearing to be the king of the Jews, or appearing to claim to be the king of the Jews, which is the charge which is leveled against him. But he is a king nonetheless. As Jesus says, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." Jesus is shifting the discussion away from the political to the spiritual, which Pilate misinterprets as the philosophical. What is truth? Pilate asks. And the irony, of course, is that the very embodiment of truth, truth with a capital T, is standing right there in front of him. What is truth? That's a pretty big question for today's world as well. So, Pilate, either regarding Jesus as harmless or simply as having no claim to be king of Judea in opposition to Caesar's rule, leaves the palace and meets with the waiting religious authorities. Pilate tells them, "I find no basis for a charge against him, but it's your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover. Do you want me to release the so-called king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now, the Synoptic Gospels also mention this custom of releasing a prisoner as a sign of Roman clemency at the festival of Passover. It seems the only other prisoner in custody at that moment is Barabbas, who is described as an insurrectionist, quite literally an actual rebel against the rule of Rome. There's a real irony here that Jesus is being accused of insurrection, declared innocent. The temple officials then request the release of an actual insurrectionist. Is this just an anybody but Jesus statement? Or is there something more devious going on? Are they still trying to convince Pilate that while Barabbas is a threat to Rome, Jesus is far worse? Well, what is significant here is that Pilate then first makes the offer to the religious authorities, not to the crowd. He goes to the religious authorities and says, "Do you want me to release Jesus to you?" You see, there is as yet no crowd. Why would there be so early in the morning? And why would there be a crowd there otherwise? You may be surprised at the answer. It's going to change the whole way in which you have a kind of visual mental picture of what's going on here. But for that, you're going to have to wait until chapter 19, and for the first half of that chapter. We'll see you next time.